So we're going to be finishing up with the first section of our ecology notes by covering a few different topics today. So key thing to remember is that ecology is all about connections and the relationship between the components of an ecosystem. And those components include living things and non-living things. And so, as we talked about when we were talking about the flow of energy, in an ecosystem, energy flow is one way. Energy is not recycled. Energy comes into the ecosystem from the sun, makes its way into producers and then into consumers. Along the way, energy is used up to maintain life functions as body heat, etc. But that energy is not recycled in the ecosystem. You need a constant input of energy. When we're talking about materials, things like carbon, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, those materials, they are recycled within an ecosystem. Okay? They move from one part of the ecosystem to another, but they are recycled. Okay? They're conserved, we might say. So we're going to just briefly talk about some of those. We don't really need to know about all the details of these systems, but I'll just talk about them a little bit. Okay? So in ecosystems, matter is recycled, but energy is not. And one important part of the ecosystem are the decomposers. Decomposers can take materials that have been incorporated into the tissue of a living organism and return it into the ecosystem so it can be recycled. So some examples of materials that get recycled: water, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. And we can see some examples. The water cycle, for example. Water takes different forms in the ecosystem. Okay? Water is in the atmosphere as water vapor. Okay? It can fall to the earth through precipitation, such as snow and rain and sleet. When that water falls as precipitation, different things can happen. Some of it can go into streams and rivers. Some of it percolates into the groundwater. Some of it ends up in oceans or lakes. Some of that evaporates, back into the atmosphere to restart that cycle. Some is absorbed by plants. So you have overall this cycling through these different components of the ecosystem, but it's the same water. Sometimes you might hear people say, the water you drink could have been dinosaur pee at one point. And that's true because that water is conserved in our planet. And so it takes different forms. Oxygen and carbon dioxide. These are recycled. Plants take in carbon dioxide, release oxygen. Animals take in oxygen, release carbon dioxide. That material moves back and forth within these cycles. Respiration returns carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The burning of fossil fuels adds to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants take it in. Waste material traps some of that. Decomposers return some of that to the atmosphere. So we have, again, the cycling of carbon. Nitrogen is a key nutrient for living things. It makes up amino acids, which make up proteins, so every living thing must have nitrogen. Actually, a huge proportion of our atmosphere, 78%, is nitrogen, but it's nitrogen gas, N2. It's really a form that's not usable by most living things. But there are some living things, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, for example, that can absorb that nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into another form, transform it into forms like ammonia or nitrate. These are forms that plants can use and can be absorbed in the roots, integrated into their tissue, and then when animals or consumers eat the plants, they obtain nitrogen. When consumers eat other consumers, they obtain nitrogen, and eventually when those organisms die, when they release waste, that nitrogen can be returned back into the soil to be recycled again. But we have this cycle of nitrogen, moving through different components of the ecosystem. Phosphorus is another example which moves through the ecosystem in different ways. Let's just take a minute. If you think about your backyard, for example, probably you or your parents mow the lawn every week or so and maintain the lawn. But if you could imagine, if you took and you stopped mowing your lawn for a month, what would it look like? Well, the grass would be long. Probably would be grass still. How about for a year? Well, maybe some different plants might start to grow there. You might have some weeds would start to grow in there other than the grass. If you didn't mow it for 5 years or 10 years, well, if you imagine what would probably happen around here, maybe some small trees would have taken hold, okay, and started to grow, some shrubs and woody plants. Well, continue that out 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. What would your backyard look like in 100 years if you stopped mowing it and just let it be? Well, in our area, most likely what your backyard would look like would be a small forest. Okay, that process, when a community changes over time, if it's left on its own, is called succession. Okay, succession is a change in a community over time until what is called a climax community is reached. The climax community is sort of the end, it's not an end really, but it's a stable community that will basically stay the same composition unless it's disturbed. In our area where we live, at our elevation, so forth, our typical climax community is a mature deciduous hardwood forest of beech, birch, maple trees. Okay, if you go and walk through a forest that's been established for a while, if you go hiking, I went hiking this weekend and I was noticing the trees in the area where I hiked, which is in the southern Adirondacks, and it's all beech, birch, maple as the dominant species where I was hiking, because that was a well-established, mature forest. It was the climax community. If you imagine, if a forest fire destroyed that ecosystem where I was hiking, destroyed all the plant matter, all the organisms there, and then it were left again for 200 years, eventually, because of this process of succession, it would probably return to that same sort of forest, because conditions in that area are what allow for the formation of those types of ecosystems. After that area were disturbed, the first species that would sort of start to colonize the area would be called the pioneer species. And it typically is fast-growing, small plants and so forth. But as they take hold, they start modifying conditions, and then larger plants come in. So this is sort of a typical timeline of what things would look like. Small plants, and then larger grasses and plants and shrubs and quick-growing trees, and eventually slower-growing trees, etc. You could even think of succession as happening in like ponds, for example. And like a man-made pond, eventually they fill up with sediment over a period of time and can get filled in. Eventually, if a pond were left to sit, it could actually become a forest. There's two types of succession. One that starts from just plain bare rock and develops into mature ecosystem. That's called primary succession. What can grow on bare rock? Things like lichens and small little sort of scaly stuff you see on rocks and things. If you go hiking and in the Adirondacks, you get to the top of a mountain, say Bald Mountain, and it's just bedrock, bare rock there. You could see growing on it these lichens. And as they grow and eventually die and decompose, they start to build up a very, very thin layer of soil. And that very thin layer of soil can then support slightly larger plants, which start to take hold and grow, develop. When they die and decompose, the soil becomes thicker. And so you have this sort of development of the ecosystem over time. Secondary succession is when there's already soil established. So you're not going from bare rock to a climax community, you're going from sort of these stages where the soil is already developed, but there's been some disturbance, sort of resetting the process and eventually leading to the mature climax community. Now, in different areas, the climax community would be different. You know, if you go up north of us, not too far into the Adirondacks or higher elevations in Canada, the climax community might be a spruce forest, okay, of evergreen trees. Okay, it's slightly different because it's cooler and there's colder conditions favor other climax communities. If you go to the Midwest of the United States, climax community might be a grassland. Other areas it might be a desert. And we call those sort of ecosystems which tend to develop in certain conditions biomes. Okay. So you see here where we are, the Northeast United States, our biome is the temperate deciduous forest, okay, hardwood forest. Just north of us here in light blue is a coniferous forest of conifer trees. Farther up in Canada and the north, the Arctic, is tundra. Okay. So different ecosystems take hold in different parts of the world based on mainly temperature and precipitation. Okay. And so we'll look at some of those. So if you sort of look at a graph showing temperature, and average precipitation, okay, if you have very warm conditions, high average temperature, and relatively low precipitation, that's when deserts form in areas that are dominated by those temperature and precipitation conditions. If you have slightly more precipitation, a savanna forms. Imagine like Africa, the savanna of Africa, where you have like sporadic trees and dry sort of grassy lands. Or you can get to where it's warm but also a lot of precipitation is where you end up with tropical rainforests. Imagine a place like Costa Rica or South America or Southeast Asia where you have these tropical rainforests. Sort of a moderate temperature and moderate precipitation, you end up in our biome, which is the temperate forest. Slightly less precipitation, and you get grasslands, shrublands. As we get into the colder conditions, we end up with a taiga or tundra, depending on the temperature and precipitation. So these are the different biomes that form in different areas. You can see in this chart sort of a little description of each of them, and tells you a little bit about where they would be found in the typical climate and typical plants and animals that you find in these different biomes. You don't need to know all the details, but it's interesting. And if you study ecology, you might study a specific biome, and sometimes ecologists will focus on the tropical rainforest or the tundra or the desert and focus their research on those specific biomes, because in those different biomes you have different adaptations. Different organisms have adapted to those biomes and have unique characteristics that allow them to be successful. The final topic we'll talk about today is this concept of biodiversity. Okay? Biodiversity is a measurement that's often used in ecology to study sort of the health of an ecosystem. When we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about how many different types of living things live in that ecosystem. How many different species are there? And often the more diversity in an ecosystem, the more stable that ecosystem is. So stable ecosystems tend to have a wide variety of different types of living things. As biodiversity is decreased, that can lead to ecosystems becoming less stable. Okay? And this is important in terms of human impacts. And we'll talk more about this in our next section, because humans are having a devastating impact on the biodiversity of our planet. Humans are destroying natural ecosystems, whether that be for farming, for living, or due to climate change. And as we destroy ecosystems and habitat and reduce the biodiversity of these ecosystems, they become less stable. Humans are causing massive extinction of different species throughout the world. And that disrupts the food web, can lead to disease spreading more easily, and this can lead to the loss of these ecosystems. We also know, and from what you study with the wolves in Yellowstone, that when humans cause the extinction of a species, often that leads to impacts throughout the ecosystem that would not maybe be considered, because of the connection of these species, because in ecosystems all these living things impact each other. Okay? Especially the extinction of an apex species like the wolves, or like this mountain lion, for example. You know, when mountain lions were hunted to extinction in certain areas, leads to less predation of deer, which leads to more deer, which leads to more grazing, which leads to overgrazing, which leads to less plants, which leads to soil erosion, which leads to no plants, which leads to no deer, and you have this cascading effect of the elimination of a single species throughout the ecosystem. Scientists will often quantify biodiversity of a species. Okay, and there's different ways of calculating how diverse an ecosystem is. One is by calculating the species richness. This is simply a count of how many different species there are in an area. Okay, so for example, if you look at these two communities, these models, these two communities, they each have 4 species present. They have the same species richness, but they don't have the same species evenness. This is another measure of biodiversity. Species evenness also takes into account how evenly distributed the number of each species are. Is the ecosystem dominated by one species with just a few of the other species present, or is it relatively evenly distributed? This is often calculated with something called a diversity index. Okay, and so when you look at community 1, community 2, community 1, okay, has a greater species evenness. Even though they have the same species richness, community 1 is a much greater evenness. There's even numbers. There's 25% of each of the species, versus community 2, which is dominated by 70% of this species and lesser numbers of the others. Okay. And there's different equations and indexes that you can calculate that will give you the diversity or the species evenness of a given ecosystem. Okay, so that's going to be it for this section. This week you're going to be doing a lab when you're going to get outside, take some pictures of some parts of the ecosystem around you and observe the ecosystem a little bit. I hope you enjoy that. Something I enjoy doing a lot and I've been doing each weekend during this quarantine is going out hiking and birding and observing some of the species in our area. So I hope that you enjoy that. So I hope you guys have a great day, and we'll talk to you later.